Right, so today we're talking about the Nikon Z9 and Z8 for wildlife photography, how I apply custom functions to the outside and get that kind of ergonomics for when I'm working in the field as a wildlife photographer. I'm going to run through how I have the camera set up, what I've got programmed to different buttons, and what I find very useful to be accessible when I'm out making pictures of wildlife. So let's get into it. Hey, what's going on guys? It's Tom Mason here, back with another video. If you're new to the channel, we talk about wildlife photography, equipment, gear, getting out into the field, making pictures of wildlife, and taking you behind the scenes of my shooting. But today we're talking about the Nikon Z9, Z8, custom functions, and how I like to have these cameras set up to help me in the field when I'm out there shooting. Now, to start with, what's the basics of setting up a camera? It doesn't matter if it's a Z8 or Z9. It's all about making sure that you can get to the key features and functionality that you need whilst your eye is to the viewfinder. This is obviously where I want to be the whole time. I want my eye to the viewfinder so I can watch my subject, anticipate movement, see where it's going, kind of plan my compositions. I don't want to be going, oh wait, I think it was on this button here, wasn't it? If I look through that, is it down there? Maybe. You don't want to be doing that in the field when everything's kicking off. You just want to literally put it to the eye, take pictures, know exactly where you can find all your settings and nail those shots. So first things first, how I have my camera set up as a basic. I use manual mode. Doesn't mean you have to, it's just how I have the camera set up. I like it because it gives me consistent exposures. I can play around with, more interesting ideas, doing pannings, like slower shutter speeds. I find that I get consistent results when in difficult lighting situations where the camera isn't going to get thrown by, moving clouds and anything like that. It's just how I've shot for a decade. I find it very kind of comfortable to me. But if you like aperture priority or anything else, that's completely fine. These settings will still work in your camera. But yeah, that's how I've got things set up. The next two big things that are key to talk about is that I use rear button focus. I disable the focus from my shutter button. That's because I only want the shutter button to take pictures and the autofocus button to autofocus. There'll be times when I've autofocused on an area, I've got it keyed in on a really nice little stick, the subject's on it. I don't want to accidentally press the autofocus, move it off that subject and miss the shot. I just want to take the picture. So that's why I have that disabled there. And then my standard default autofocus mode for the camera is single point. This is kind of throwback to DSLR days. I've always used single point. I find it very useful for picking out specific areas of a composition, making sure I lock my focus on a very key region when I'm trying to make something out. And that's just how I've always worked. But as we'll talk about going forward, I obviously do use other autofocus modes. I've just got them assigned in different ways on the camera. Now, the first thing I'm going to do, talking about autofocus, is I'm going to come into the camera and I'm going to actually disable something. I'm going to go up to A9, down here. I'll obviously show you on the screen what I'm doing, and I'm going to restrict the focus mode to only use continuous AF. Obviously, when we're photographing wildlife, our subjects are moving, we want continuous focus to keep up with them. I never accidentally want to be outside continuous autofocus, accidentally have been crawling across a field, pressed in the AF mode, scroll whilst I'm changing shutter speed, inadvertently changed it from the mode and then being single autofocus, being like, why won't you track the subject? No, I don't have to worry about that. So I simply disable it, keep myself in continuous the whole time, and I'm never going to have to worry about it. Even if I press the button and I'm trying to scroll it out of AFC, it's not going to happen exactly where I want it to be. And that's the first thing I set up on the camera. Number two, we're actually going to start diving into the custom control functionality down on F2, custom controls for shooting. And we're going to dial in our different AF modes to start with. Now, obviously now with the modern cameras, I've got dynamic modes, I've got, tracking modes, I've all sorts of different things. But there are three that I've really come to use. Single point, my standard, easy to pick out, very, little subjects in the frame. Dynamic mode that I've actually programmed to the FN1 button and the FN3 button. Dynamic small is what I use. It gives me very good control over my composition. I can set up very small in the frame subjects. Yet what dynamic mode does is it tends the autofocus to whatever closest to you. So if you've got a little bird sticking up a little stick, kingfisher on a branch, but with difficult foliage behind it, it's going to tend the autofocus to that stick in the front rather than trying to get confused on the background. Something that's very, very useful, especially when you're using long lenses, because you'll find that in some of the other modes, you ping off to the background, the autofocus can think, oh, it's definitely here, when actually the subject's far, far closer than that. But if you've got dynamic mode set up on that front button, it'll immediately pull back forwards, rack in, so you can nail the shot of that subject that's much closer to you. And I use that all the time. It's also very good for subjects that are moving through foliage. So yeah, dynamic mode is kind of my go-to when subjects are moving or close in and I want to continue tracking them. Obviously, you don't get eye detection on that, but I find it's almost like single point, but on steroids for close stuff or moving things. Really, really handy. And that's assigned to the FN1 button and the FN3 button on my Z9, or just the FN1 button on my Z8. The reason it's the FN1 button and the FN3 button on my Z9 is simply because obviously when I'm shooting horizontally or shooting vertically, it's in the same position for me on the camera. That means I can easily, touch it, get to it. And again, I don't overcomplicate things. If I make multiple different ones on every single button, it's going to be hard to remember what I've got there. So I keep it very simple, that they're the same wherever I'm kind of turning the camera around. That's what I want in position. Now, the next button that I change is coming to the controls, FN2, and it's actually my joystick button. Now, my little joystick buttons here, and again here for when I'm in vertical, I assign that when I press it in, it's using 3D tracking. This means that, of course, if my subject is nice and obvious, the camera's going to latch onto those eyes, keep with it as the subject's moving around. If I've got birds in flight, anything like that, where I can get that subject detection to work perfectly, the 3D tracking is going to lock it, hold it, and just allow me to just continue that focus on the subject. And this is a mode that I use all the time nowadays when it comes to shooting wildlife, and I find it extremely handy to have it there. So I can literally go single point, dynamic, 3D tracking in the blink of an eye, obviously with my eye completely attached to the viewfinder, never having to take a moment from my subject. Now, one key thing to think about when you set these up is to make sure that if you're using rear button focus like I am, that you have the setup that also uses the AF on plus next to it. It has to say the AF mode that you want to select and then AF on plus, because that's going to mean that as you press that button down, whether it's the FN1, FN3, and either joystick, you're going to initiate the autofocus to change, firstly to give you dynamic or 3D, but also then be an AF on button as well to actually start the tracking of the autofocus. That means that then you don't have to try and hold the joystick and the AF on button to initiate focus. That is what happens if you don't tick the plus AF on that. So make sure you do that. So that's how I have my AF button set up. Very simple, 3 different modes, single point as a standard, then I use the dynamic and the 3D tracking. Now, there are times when I will come down, use this, and maybe change over to like a wide area or something like that if I'm constantly doing like birds in flight or something like that. But for 90% of the time when I'm going out to the field and maybe, I might come across all variety of, scenarios and shooting, this is how I'm set up and ready to go. And I think it's a really good place to be, and I don't find any problems with it when I'm out shooting day to day. Right, so next up, another control that I'm going to change in FN2 is very simply as I'm going to reassign the movie button to be my crop button. I can just simply hold it down and FX, DX, no worries whatsoever, really simple. And again, don't have to take my eye from the viewfinder. I've kind of got that built-in teleconverter ready to go. And you can do it instantly when your subjects are moving to change that composition. Having fingertip control of all these things is an absolute must when it comes to wildlife photography. So that's my next one to do. Right, so next up is kind of a bonus tip. I'm actually going to come into the controls and what I'm going to do is I'm going to disable the quality button. The reason for this is in the past I have muffed up and I've been laying down at a very awkward angle, have my hand touch the quality button. As I've been changing settings in manual mode, changed myself from RAW to JPEG and then shot a whole sequence of pictures that I was really happy with in JPEG. And I never want to do that again, so I've disabled the quality button, so even if I press it, I actually can't change myself out of RAW shooting. That is exactly where I want to be, and yeah, that might just save you a bit of headache. So go ahead and do that, because if you're like me, you never want to shoot anything other than raw pictures. So once I've got it set, I want to forget about it. So I can't change that now. That I find really handy. Right, so with our AF modes program, we've got that cropping modes. We've reduced the fact that we can now not accidentally change out of continuous mode or change the quality. What's next? Well, it's a bit of a change to me. That is the FN2 button. Now, when I originally had my Z9, I had a different autofocus set up here as well to use that wide area. Now, it might be something you want, but I've recently changed the button to use the recall setting function, and this is wicked. This is just so helpful. The reason it's super useful is because I like to experiment with my photography. I'm always doing like panning shots, movement shots. I'm scrolled down to like, you know, shooting like a second or a 20th of a second. And then what happens, of course, is bang, some wildlife turns up and I think, oh God, I need to like 1,000th of a second. I need to get back to f4. And, you know, a lot of the time you just can't get it right in time. I was always happy with that trade-off because I wanted to create the creative images that I was prepared to lose frames in terms of adjusting settings between different styles. But nowadays, I don't have to do that anymore because my FN2 button immediately ports me back to using a fast shutter speed. It actually switches me out of manual mode into aperture priority. It will immediately drop my aperture to the lowest possible. So here I've got f4, it'll drop me to f4. If I'm using my 300 2.8, it'll drop me to 2.8, the 600 f4 to f4, etc. And then it will mean that it dials in a collection of settings to make it the best chance for me to have that fast shutter speed to freeze an image so I can nail those kind of classic portraits. And this is just game changer because you can go from doing creative images to like very simple, like static, fast shutter speed portraits in an instant by just holding that button down and shooting. There you go. I'm back up to a fast shutter speed and I can nail that shot. Again, F2, coming down, custom controls, the FN2 button to use the recall shooting function, and then you can go across and program in what you want. I changed it to aperture priority because obviously that means it automatically predicts my shutter speed. Aperture 2.8, that's because my kind of lowest aperture lenses that I'm mostly using for this kind of work are 2.8, means it will just go to widest if not on that. Exposure compensation I dial in at -2/3, and then the ISO sensitivity I've programmed it to jump up to 800 just because in most scenarios that's going to give me enough shutter speed to freeze the image and nail that picture. Really easy. Obviously AF selection will go back to whatever I'm using. So if I'm holding the FN2 button and I'm in single point here, or I can be in dynamic, or I can be in 3D tracking whilst those settings are still in place. So useful. Just means that you're always there, ready to recall, a fast shutter speed to immediately nail that picture. Game changer in terms of setting, and it's one that I absolutely love having now on my Z9 and Z8, and certainly one you should play about with and set up. But yeah, that's how I've got things set up. I would really love to know if there's anything that you think, Tom, you need to try this, or have you thought about this? Is there anything here that you've now added to your camera that you're finding really useful? I'd love to know down in the comments. Drop it below. If you've got any questions about wildlife photography, of course, drop them down and I'm more than happy to get back to you. If you found this useful, found this kind of, you know, helpful in setting up your camera, please like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out, helps push these videos out to more people to help them with the wildlife photography. But until the next one, guys, grab your camera, get out there, go photograph some wildlife. And I'll see you soon.